when we think about the very first rail project here, where did it go? From downtown Minneapolis to the airport. That is not about transit service. That is about economic development. And so
plop down a station and hope that a bunch of development springs up around that station so you can increase tax revenue. That's
you got it, right? The idea is that you spend an ass load of money, like just so much money, but that it's going to fundamentally transform the station routing, right? It is why the very first light rail line is from downtown Minneapolis, so our core economic center, out to the airport. You're taking people from the core out to the airport and back. You're shuttling them back and forth. And the idea is that also that development is going to happen completely along the route, right? People are going to choose to live along that route. Big major investments are going to happen from, point A to point B.
We're rolling. We're rolling.
Calling out tap people. This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.
Okay, this is the Wedge Live podcast. We're doing a transit episode, and my guest today, back for another stint, is PeggySue Imihy, and for the first time, Jonathan Ahn. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, John. You got like a great shirt on. You're ready.
It's true, and I got this Aldi background. Did you notice the Aldi background?
What does it say?
It says Aldi, make it an Aldi holiday. It was signage that was in the store, and someone pulled it from the trash for me. So,
wow, you have some dedicated friends.
It's true. So, can you both introduce yourself a little bit? Because I'll screw it up. Just give her as much or as little information as you want. PeggySue.
This is maybe my fourth time co-hosting with you, which is fun. Thanks for having me back. I am a planner. I work for the City of Hopkins, which is really fun because it is a really, really cool community. And I love transit. I grew up riding the bus. We never had a car. So great pick for the transit episode. I've ridden all of them. And super excited to be here. So thanks for having me.
Can we mention that you're going to be on the Planning Commission?
Well, yeah, we can. I haven't been formally appointed, but I have been recommended for appointment. So John bullied me into, I guess maybe not. Bully is aggressive.
I'm willing to take credit.
Okay, perfect. John bullied me into being on the Planning Commission. So now I'm going to be a Minneapolis Planning Commissioner. Which I'm super excited about. I mean, I guess it's like sort of pending like any chaos, right? So I've been kind of like, you never know with new councils, right? So I'm technically a council appointed member is what I'm being recommended for. And that happened in December. And that won't go to the new council until January. So I don't, as city staff, I'm always like, you fucking never know what could happen. Like a new council could see it and be like, I don't know, have feelings about it. I'm not really sure how that works in Minneapolis, right? In terms of like, it's a staff recommendation.
I think you'll be
now
okay.
They have this new strong. Yeah, I don't know. I'm probably panicking for no reason, but I'm kind of like,
people are going to be
apart. I don't know.
People are going to be so concerned with their new job, they're not going to go back and try to undo the appointments or the recommendations. Can we play your theme song? Are we allowed to do that?
Sure.
Okay, this is theme song.
I'm sorry, Jonathan. Did you make John his own theme song?
No.
Or are you just
No. Jonathan doesn't get his own theme song.
I'm just the first timer.
Jonathan, did you know PeggySue's a former Miss Northeast Minneapolis?
I did not know that.
Yeah. I never know what to do.
There she is, Miss
Northeast Minneapolis.
Okay, Jonathan, now it's your turn.
Wow, that's hard to beat. Hello. My name is Jonathan. I'm a transit and rail planner. I don't work for any city or any transit agency. I'm on in the industry, we call it on the private side as a consultant. But I work with a lot of transit agencies and municipalities across the country. I've been doing this for about 5-ish years, but I mostly focus on a lot of bus rapid transit and light rail. So this is kind of my jam. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. And I don't know if I introduced myself. I'm John Edwards, your host, and I live in the Wedge. And I moved to the Wedge because it is so transit accessible. I know, Jonathan, you used to live in the Wedge. That's why I live here.
I did. Yeah, sad to leave the Wedge behind, but now I'm settled in Kingfield, which I'm pretty happy with, but can't beat the transit options in the Wedge.
So have you been following the Linden Hills thing with the BRT and the trees and all the comments the Metro Transit's received on the BRT station? Can BRT stations and trees coexist? Seems like it would be we could find a way to keep trees and bus stations. Jonathan, do you have any professional opinions on that?
They should really coexist. Trees and BRT station objects should really not conflict each other. It's what I should say. I like waiting for the bus on the tree shade, so I think it's actually more of an amenity to have some trees and greeneries around the transit stations. If we have to accommodate a transit station structure, you might have to relocate a tree or two, but in most cases, I support trees and transit station structures to be, coexisting in a harmonious way.
That's good. PeggySue, do you support both trees and transit?
I mean, I think in a future-focused, environment where we're thinking about shifting modalities and also ensuring like heat resiliency, both of those things seem important. So I don't know. I guess I'm not as up to speed on like the exact issues in Linden Hills.
It's the biggest news in Linden Hills.
Well, and there hasn't been news in Linden Hills ever, so I don't know. This is, to me, this is just like an insane conversation that's happening in Linden Hills. I feel like I've like completely tuned it out because I just have like the hope that Metro Transit is just kind of going to be like, whatever. We don't care about like the 87 rich people who live in Linden Hills who don't want transit when it's like already like a pretty major transit corridor, right? Like you're already getting a ton of bus traffic through there already. Like that's the reason BRT is being considered. Like right. Metro Transit isn't just like putting BRT like wherever it feels like it, right? Like BRT is a replacement for like already pretty rapid or like significant bus routing. So this shouldn't be like a shock to Linden Hills people. Like there are already many buses, right? So I don't know. It's really silly. I feel like there's this I feel like NIMBYs always want like a really noble cause, right? Like they want something that makes it feel like we're not saying we don't want the poor people who take transit. And so like the environment or like trees like are the noble cause, right? Like that's the thing where like you can't tell me like my opinion's wrong because it's trees.
Right.
Which is so like, I don't know. I think it's just like, it's like a really false argument when the reality is right. Is not trees. It's likely that we don't want increased bus service or the feeling that we're going to get increased bus service, even though you're not. So, or maybe like marginally increased bus service through BRT. So I don't know. I think that a lot of times in neighborhoods, and this happens with like all development, right? It's just sort of like, well, we have to pick the thing that is the least inoffensive to get us to be able to say no to something.
Yeah, I don't know if trees are number one concerns to them. Like they talk about, you want to protect the trees, but I think they're just using the trees as an argument against it instead of talking about their actual concerns. And we haven't even touched, the number one excuse that a lot of people love to bring with parking.
True. Yeah. It's a big issue on Hennepin Avenue. We could talk about that a little bit. So
yeah, go straight to the beast.
Yeah. So they're removing a bunch of spots on Hennepin Avenue. It turns out the parking on Hennepin Avenue itself is 10% of the available parking along the corridor. So you've got parking ramps and private parking lots, and you've got side street parking. And the parking on Hennepin Avenue is only 10% of that. It's less than half of the on-street parking on the corridor. City did a parking study that showed something like only 50 to 75% of the parking is in use, even during high, peak times. So it seems like a big deal to take the vast majority of parking on Hennepin Avenue and put in a bus lane. If you look at the numbers, it's not really that big a deal. And you talk to a lot of people who say they don't even want to park on Hennepin Avenue. People who drive, like, why would I want to park on Hennepin Avenue and immediately step out of my car into this mess? Of course, I'm going to park on a side street if I have the option. So, I don't know, Jonathan, can you talk?
Hennepin Avenue is a known destination for easy parking. So
Right.
A lot of people from Chanhassen could drive and park on Hennepin Avenue.
So either one of you, maybe Jonathan, talk about the importance of transit priority, the importance of bus lanes on Hennepin Avenue, 24/7 bus lanes. I think a counter argument might be just make them part-time, just how they are now, and let people park in them the rest of the day.
I think the full-time, the importance of having a full-time bus lane is you get to avoid the issue that we had previously with the part-time pilot that we had on transit priority lane on Hennepin Avenue, where in off-peak hours on off-peak direction that is used as parking lane or people park on the street, that the compliance when it actually switches to the bus lane wasn't really 100% good, which affects the quality and the reliability of underlying transit service that we're trying to improve. So I think it's important to just make it easy, just make it full-time, paint it red, and have reliable bus service that's more attractive to more people.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree 100%, right? Like, sure, you could say, like, well, let's just keep the part-time bus lanes, if we need, if peak service is the priority, do part-time bus lanes. I have some sympathy, right? Where I think there is this belief for businesses that if someone isn't parking literally in front of my storefront, they're not coming. And I think there is some degree with COVID where, like, not to play the devil's advocate, right, on this, because I'm fully in agreement, like, just get rid of the parking. It's such a minuscule amount. But I think that there's this perception, right, that people are not doing the, like, leisurely strolling up and down any given, like, urban street. They're literally coming to do a thing and get the heck out, right? And so if I, as a business, don't have that space right in front of my store, no one's coming into my business to do that, like, one quick errand. The reality is that the likelihood that your business has that space right in front of it for that 1, 2, 3 customers is really marginal, right? There's just not a big probability that that space is even open for those customers. So, like, you have a parking problem already that is completely unrelated to whether or not the parking is removed or not. Because there's so limited parking. Again, it's only 10%, right? So the vast majority of your customers aren't coming from that parking space right in front of your store. And I think that there's just this concern that, like, or this belief, I think you see this in homeowners too, where, like, they believe they own, like, what's right in front of the row in your street. The right of way belongs to you. Like, don't park in front of my house because those spaces belong to me. And I think there's that belief too with business owners that, like, those spaces, like, no one's parking in front of my store and then going 3 blocks, like, south or north. Like, those spaces are only for my business. And I think the reality is that, like, anytime I think I've, like, driven anywhere in Uptown, which is a nightmare, I'd much rather take the bus. I'm parking on a side street. I'm parking somewhere super far away because there isn't that spot in front of a store. And it's like, why am I parking on Hennepin to get murdered once I immediately step out of my vehicle? So I don't know. It seems really silly. And I think it's just this, like, notion that business owners are very misguided and that, like, people are literally parking in front of their spaces. And without those spaces, they can't fathom how else people would get to their store. So I don't know. It's just, I think it's also just like a like a transit bias. Like I think that there's a lot of people who just really think like people aren't using transit. They're not using that modality to get to any one place. And I think that continued headlines in the news about how like down transit ridership is or how people aren't taking the bus really like enforces that rhetoric for people who really want to believe that people don't take the bus. And like, like this is the reality is like I have to drive to work every day because I live in Minneapolis and I work out in the suburbs, whatever. But like that doesn't stop me from taking the bus or like taking another mode of transit inside the city. And I think that that viewpoint is really narrow for a lot of people, and especially I think the people who own these businesses and probably don't live on Hennepin, right? Like, where does the owner of the Cat Cafe live? I don't know, but I feel like probably not in the vicinity. Otherwise, this is not an opinion they would probably have.
Well, I mean, there are some business owners, I think, or at least one who lives in the neighborhood and is also like very up in arms. But there's 15,000 people who live in neighborhoods to either side of this project, like right along. 15,000 people. I assume that's a big part of why these businesses want to locate in the area, and not because it's convenient to drive an uptown, because it definitely is not convenient to drive an uptown. All things being equal, I don't want to be in Minneapolis at all if driving is my priority. So,
I mean, I do sympathize, in a way about these business owners that the visual way of seeing where your customer is coming, as PeggySue just mentioned, like your parking spot right in front of your business is the only way that many business owners kind of train to visualize that's where your customers are coming from. Because you don't really ask your customers, did you walk, did you bike, did you transit to your business. So in a way, I'm very excited that having that red carpet lane, that red transit priority lanes, and more upgraded amenities at transit stops, and having more just nicer buses around, just putting them on the street as a visible queue, I think that will really show that transit is also a dignified way of mode of transportation, just like, if not better than just driving and coming to your business.
So what is the state of transit in the Twin Cities? We're still in the midst of a pandemic. Ridership took a hit, as PeggySue was mentioning all the news stories about that. The bus driver shortage, I think they're like 80 drivers short. They've had to cut service in response to that. Where are we? What is the state of transit? Are we in a death spiral? Is it going to be good again? Are we going to be okay?
I hope not. I hope it's not a death spiral. I mean, it's been a struggle, and it's not just the Twin Cities, like all over the world and all over the country, that transit and just industry and people have been all struggling. Transit ridership's been down, as everyone knows. But I'm pretty optimistic about what's in the pipeline and what could happen in the future that would really put transit forward and equal level and above level of other modes of transportation. Like arterial BRT that's in the pipeline, like the D line that's under construction in Chicago, and Fremont and Emerson, and E line and F line, G line, H line. The list goes on. And as we implement those network of enhanced services like the real metro in our Twin Cities, then I'm pretty optimistic, and actually very optimistic about the future of the transit industry in Twin Cities.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like two different, like your question has two different like lanes of answer, right? Like I'm with Jonathan 100%. I think that there's so much in the hopper in terms of like metro transit projects that are happening, and even like in suburban transit too, right? Like we're seeing really cool innovations from like Southwest and MBTA with like a sort of more Uber style busing system in suburban areas. So with, I don't know, Southwest Prime, I think is what they call it.
Southwest Prime, yeah.
Yeah. And then MBTA, I don't remember what MBTA calls theirs. Do you know what they call it, Jonathan?
I don't know.
I don't know.
feel like I should know that. Yeah.
It's not important, but like it's essentially, I mean, it's the same as Southwest Prime. MBTA has a very similar where you can literally pay an extra fare for a smaller bus to come right to your house, like an Uber, and drop you right at your destination. I think you're seeing, especially with bigger employers moving out into suburban areas like the Amazons, the Canterbury Parks, like, the Opus campuses having these big job hubs. You're seeing transit be built. We're still having Godspeed. We will still have Southwest LRT someday. Blue Line is moving forward. So I think in terms of like really big transit funded projects, those things are all still very much happening despite the like literal this moment in time version of what's existing for transit ridership. I think the employment side of things, like I have no answer on how do we have more bus drivers, right? It's a whole like a big, much bigger conversation in terms of like employment and like economic development as like from a jobs standpoint, right? Because we have so many people who are going to college, even though like we have this huge labor shortage of manual labor, which bus drivers kind of fall into. And I think that that's like completely other conversation. And I don't know how we solve that one, but I do think that like broadly transit projects are going to continue to happen.
Yeah, and I'll also add to that it's my non-answer that we don't really know the future of pandemic, that how the future of work will return to, that everyone's going to work from home forever for all the white collar worker versus, or everyone's going to be all in the office like pre-pandemic. We don't know that yet. So it's hard to predict what the travel pattern would change. Previously, just like many other cities in the U.S., Metro Transit's and Twin Cities transit system really focused on those peak commute travel, bringing people to downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul from all over the metro area, and then bring them back home in the evening hours on the weekday. Those peak direction trips been very much of a focus, and they've been performing pretty well. But now that the travel pattern is kind of changing, that we are making more weekend trips or we are making more spontaneous weekday trips all to non-work destinations, I think transit system could also be a little more flexible about revising the service patterns, I would say, to reflect the demand changes.
And I think that's happening too. I think especially like in places like MBTA where the service planning is more nimble than Metro Transit and it's easier to make those routing adjustments. You're seeing them make that routing for, off-peak hours or more weekend routing. And I agree with Jonathan that I think that that's definitely going to happen. And I think the other thing, and I don't know, this is sort of like, maybe it's like really optimistic, but it's sort of like a too big to fail situation. We have a little bit in some of these things, right? Like Southwest LRT, definitely too big to fail at this point. Like it is happening. Too much money has happened. Like it's happening. And I think the same with kind of like, whether that's like a permanent full-time return to work, I don't know that any company is going to be like super thrilled about making workers do that. Well, there are companies, but I do think that like downtown has some really big development projects. It's really hard to not talk about like transit and development at the same time as like functions of each other. But I think there's some really enormous development projects happening downtown that I think are still going to drive that desire for office workers to either want or employers to want office workers to be back downtown. And that drives that transit demand too. So I'm thinking like the Four Seasons development is massive. There's a handful of periphery projects along Washington into the North Loop that are going to be really big. RBC Gateway finishing. So I think that like sort of revival of downtown is kind of happening at the right moment as hopefully the pandemic kind of ends, where downtown is going to have, again, these sort of like too big to fail projects where they're going to want workers to come back downtown and maybe some really cool amenities that are starting to draw workers back downtown.
I think this may be one of the most asked questions when I put it out on Twitter, what people want to know about. Maybe that's too strong, but it was a popular one. The idea of free transit. And does anyone have strong opinions either way on the topic of free transit?
That is a difficult question, I think. In principle, yes, I think we need to prioritize affordable, accessible transit. But the politics of transit and how transit as an infrastructure and the public services that we offer to many people has been very politicized. I think we need to discuss and talk about how we can ensure that our transit system and people who work on transit system are adequately funded, that we can maintain and continue to grow. And it's interesting because there aren't that many pots of money that transit agents can tap into to operate their services, which is different from to build new services. I think, if I recall correctly, in Minnesota, you're not allowed to use property tax. And I think the number one source of operating fund for Metro Transit is motor vehicle sales tax. So we are essentially funding the operation of our transit service by selling a lot of cars in Minnesota. So the more cars you sell in Minnesota, the better operating fund you get in transit funding in a way. So we need to understand the dynamics of where the money is currently coming from, and then where we can reliably get the funding from for those operation needs. Unless we solve that issue, I can't really jump on like that should be the top priority for increasing access for transit. I really applaud the TAP program, the Transit Assistant program that offers discounted $1 ride to low-income people who qualify. So I want to see more of those being marketed, and I want to see that program to be expanded more so it's more accessible to more people.
Right. Metro Transit says there's around 10,000 people who use those. Is it reduced fare or free fare?
Reduced
fare.
10,000 people use the reduced fare passes, but we know many more residents are eligible. So there's a conflict between better service or lower fares. Certain amount of Metro Transit's budget is what they call fare box recovery, right? And so,
and I think we're still mandated to have a certain level of fare box recovery, probably around 1/3 or 30% or so.
I think it's important to acknowledge that, like, it is a cost. Your experience on transit is a cost. If the trip is longer, if there aren't as many buses, if you're inconvenienced, that's a cost to people. And then the money that would have gone to providing better fares. I mean, ideally, we'd have all the money in the world to throw at this, but we don't. If you make trips longer for people or more inconvenient, there's a cost to that. And on the other side, like when they reduced the fares to $1 in September and October, I mean, that got me riding transit more than I was before. Like even I'm sensitive to price. I know I look like a big fancy man living in the Wedge with a podcast and everything, but that got me riding buses more. So
I'll add one thing too, which is, I think that to kind of just like to add into what Jonathan's saying about just like how cars kind of fund, our transit system in part, like they're also funding like road improvements and, we need roads for buses and cars, right? But we're also like the metro area is just such a small part of like a much larger state, right? When you look at the assets of the state of Minnesota, like most of the assets are the state's roads. And so I think that that's a tough split financially, especially with much of greater Minnesota essentially being like likely a huge pain in the ass to that issue, right? Like I just don't see that being like a big priority when the pots of money are really, really small. I will say that Metro Transit is getting like really creative about some of those things. So like the TAP program that you mentioned is really cool, but then they're also starting a program that I don't think it's talked a lot about because it's not like a giant program. I think they're starting to kind of pilot it, which is like a residential pass program. And so there's, in low income or like multifamily buildings and multifamily properties can purchase one pass per unit for unlimited rides for $14 a month per pass. So it's like an 88% discount.
Just $14? I thought it was going to be 20.
Yes.
$14.
1-4.
And it's not just low income. It's like if you build an apartment building, you can sign up for this program, provide passes.
Yeah. So I don't know. That's something that like I don't know a lot about it because we don't have any properties in Hopkins who do this, and I don't know how big the list of properties that do this are. But I think that Metro Transit is getting creative. I think in some of those ways. So I think it's really easy. I know like this is like not the fun answer or like the like get your fans answer is like to remember that like the state of Minnesota is like much larger than the Twin Cities, and those are some of the forces at play when we talk about like free transit, right? Or even reducing transit costs is largely most of the state won't get to see that money, right? And that's like, there's already so much like angry vibes around the Met Council. And then there's also transit providers that aren't Metro Transit in the state, right? And how does that affect them? Like, how do they provide those levels of service when their transit costs are probably significantly more expensive because somewhere like Duluth or Rochester is serving a much smaller service area? So it's very easy to like forget that there's like other transit systems in the state. Like that money is getting split up a lot of different ways. And I don't know. I mean, it's also like a bigger, like a federal question too, right? Of like, we just came back from Paris, like one of the like most like socialist states in the European Union, and you're paying an assload for transit fare, right? And they have an amazing transit system, and you're not getting that for free, right? Even though it's a pretty subsidized, like you pay a lot of taxes, and that's giving you a lot of amazing benefits, and free transit isn't one of them, right? And so, now that being said, there's like their taxes are paying for lots of things that ours aren't paying for. But I know, I think that there's like a lot of bigger questions than like, does it sound like nice? And would I love it? 100%. Does it seem that feasible? Probably no.
And also better transit is a benefit to low income and working class people. Better service is a benefit to people who ride transit. Like, and if there's a trade-off, we need to consider what those trade-offs are.
All this discussion about what we can do and what we can't do and this different pot of monies and how the fare should be set and what is fair to people, I think a lot of it actually go back to, I want to just dump this responsibility to state legislature, because a lot of this framework that we discuss and how the funding is set, it relies heavily on the state policy and the state budget. So I would love to see a champion in the State House or the State Senate that really push for more reliable funding for operations for transit, not just in the Twin Cities, but across the state. That'd be great. Then we wouldn't have to worry about how we're going to make up the money that we're not going to get from the fare.
Yeah. And I think that the other thing that is like a part of this conversation too is that like this like sort of misnomer that doesn't get talked about of like that like all the low income people live in the Twin Cities, right? Which is like largely not the case. There is so many people in major cities around the state who are reliant on transit or wish that they had better transit, right? Like when the average cost of a vehicle ownership is $10,000 a year, like that's so much money to a low income family who in greater Minnesota, we know is struggling with like access to childcare, right? There's not good access to childcare. It's extremely expensive, are often in lower wage jobs, and then are spending significantly more on fuel costs. I think that there's a real benefit to also having a broader conversation about what does expanded transit access look like in places like Duluth or Rochester or Mankato or Moorhead, right? So it would be nice to have some champions, not just one, like many champions talking about this at the state level, because when we talk about like neutrality, like carbon neutrality as a state, like we are not going to solve it, the Twin Cities alone. There has to be these bigger pushes in places where there are like Rochester's doing amazing things in terms of like transit and reducing vehicle miles traveled, but it has to happen everywhere. And there has to be the conversation of in those smaller places too.
Okay, we're going to the phones. Our first ever call in to the Wedge Live podcast. Caller, what's your name and where are you from?
My name is Sam Penders. I live in the Wedge Region 1, actually, if you want to be specific.
Okay, caller. Thank you for calling in. What is your issue?
I have a kind of issue or question about the B line. So the B line is going to be the next Metro Transit arterial bus rapid transit line that's going to be built. It's going to go from Uptown to St. Paul Union Depot along Lake Street. And so this will open in 2024. Construction will start in like 2023. So they're kind of finalizing what the actual like detailed plans will be at this point. And so Metro Transit kind of presented like three different options for what the bus priority on Lake Street could be. You could pretty much do like basically no bus priority. You could get what they called like balanced bus priority, which meant bus lanes at some points and do a 4-to-3 conversion. Or they could do what was called extensive bus priority, which was bus lanes in both directions for the entire duration of Minneapolis. So initially, Jonathan actually noticed on Twitter that like the city had a letter drafted about this with their recommendations for what they'd want from like the Infrastructure and Public Works Committee. And they weren't really asking for bus lanes at all. So he kind of called it out, and I helped get people to like comment to their city council member asking for them to actually be asking for bus lanes throughout the entire duration. And so it came to this committee, and Council President Bender was really kind of saying, we need to like amend this letter to ask for bus lanes. And she said, wherever possible. All the council members on the committee agreed. So that seemed like a big victory, and we kind of celebrated that. Like it seemed like they were asking for bus lanes in both directions for the entirety because they said we want bus lanes wherever possible. But then after this happened, I actually looked at the letter, and it does say the city's preference is for and I'm quoting it here, the city's preference is for dedicated transit lanes wherever possible to meet our transit service, climate, and mode shift goals in alignment with whatever plans. But then in a bullet point right below, it says we want a 4 to 3 lane conversion with a bus lane in one direction for a significant portion of Lake Street. So that actually isn't the wherever possible option. This is kind of the scaled back compromise option.
Do we know if that was a drafting? Was that a drafting error? Did they accidentally leave in a bullet point, or are they trying to weasel out of it?
I think they actually added this in.
Okay. Well, that's weaselly.
So I kind of feel like we got duped.
We got duped. Does anyone else have any opinions about whether we got duped, or what is is it Beeline? What's the Lake Street letter? I can't keep these straight.
Yeah, it's B.
The Beeline on Lake Street.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up to attention, Sam, when I first posted on Twitter. And I kind of dropped the ball after that. I thought that was a victory, and I dropped the ball and didn't really check what the revised letter would read.
You got to read the bullet points.
Yeah, I got to read the bullet points, and I forgot to do that. And I think I don't want to speculate too much on what's actually going on within the project team because I'm, again, not involved in any work that's actually happening. But my guess is there are a lot of different parties involved. It's a county road, so there's going to be opinion from Hennepin County that's kind of pushing the directions of how the road reconfiguration would look like. And again, the City of Minneapolis staff and the letter and the Metro Transit's desire to have service that's reliable. So those conflicts or different ideals how Lake Street should look like, I don't think that's coming out in the surface until we see the final layout.
PeggySue, you work in government. Is that Weasley? What's going on? You need to speculate. Can you speculate for us?
I don't know. I don't want to speculate too much because this is like sort of the first I'm hearing of this conversation, right? Like I haven't really stayed fully into this. And I would probably like side more on the like where Jonathan's coming at, where it's as a staff person, it's really tough to work with like a lot of agencies on a project. So in this situation, you have city staff, probably from multiple departments. You have Hennepin County because it's Hennepin County Road. You have the Met Council because you're dealing with bus. So it can be really difficult to like figure out in that power struggle who is the winner, right? Like who gets to decide what happens on the road. A lot of times, and now this is like just saying completely aside, right? Like from this project, a lot of times the county is going to be the winner, right? Because, and Jonathan, you can thumbs up or thumbs down on this. In my experience working with counties, not just Hennepin County, the county owns the road, right? So they're probably not like plowing it or doing a lot of like maintenance in that way, but they are the owner of the road. And so unless there's like a turn back, right? Like unless they're thinking that they're going to give Lake Street back to the city in some quick time, a lot of times they're going to be the ones who get to make the final decision, even if the city has like hopes and dreams, right? So I've worked on projects where we are going to get the road turned back to us. And so they say like, we don't really care. Like your word, this isn't going to be our road in 5 years or however many years, like as a county, like do whatever you want to do. Or they're going to turn it back to the city and they still want to be the people who say what happens on the road, even though it's not going to be their road in 5 years. And that's kind of my, at the end of the day, like the City of Minneapolis could say like, we want the road to be blue and it to snow on it all the time. And the county would say, it's our road. We're not going to let you do any of those things. And so there has to be that partnership and not knowing, other than just knowing the politics of like, when it's a city, like is really like it's going through the city, and that's kind of the city's maybe only ownership, or the city's like plowing it and it just happens to go through the city. Like it can just be really tough. Like it's the county's road. And so city staff can make recommendations. They can kind of say like, this is our vision for this. And at the end of the day can get completely overruled.
I wish in your answer talking about different interests telling staff what to do from different agencies and government layers of government, I wish you would use the phrase 14 bosses.
I mean, it's kind of like that, right? There's like, I don't know.
Do we need a strong regional king style strong mayor for
we
the
have
region?
that, it's Met Council.
That's
county executive, yeah.
Yeah. And that's the thing, right, is that it is almost sort of like a 14 bosses situation, right? Like, because imagine this, Jonathan is a planner for a consulting firm working on a project for Metro Transit. This is how convoluted transit planning can be. And I'm very sorry, Jonathan, to like throw like consulting one, not under the bus a little, but like under the bus a little, right? So imagine you're doing a transit project, right? Metro Transit is going to own the transit project. And then they're going to be consultants working on the transit project. So Jonathan is now the consultant for a project. He's working on it, but maybe he has some sub-consultants for the project too. So there's a bunch of planners. All those planners, they make a recommendation. They give that to the transit agency. Then separately, the city has planners and they have their own plans and they have everything else they want to do. And they have a council, right? This can be in any city. They have a council that has their own priorities and their own goals, right? And they have a recommendation. And then the county has that, right? Or the state, if it's a state aid road, right? So they have all their roles and their bosses, right? Like in terms of like, you know, the like county commissioners and everyone through the whole ladder of public works at Hennepin County, right? And so then all three of those people have to meet in a room and kind of like fight it out of who gets to be in charge. And you have this project that like, you know, Jonathan's interpretation of the county plans and the city plans that he used to decide his recommendation that he offered to Metro Transit is Jonathan's interpretation of that. And that could have changed, right? Like, because now you have a different council. And so that those plans that he used, you have a council who might not care about them anymore, right? So that's how, like, over these long projects, there are like 87 million people who get involved. And you end up with things where you're like, is that a mistake in a staff report? Is that the city just kind of like trying to cover their ass? Like, you have no idea, right? Because it could also be like 5 planners working on something and them all trying to like do the best they can, knowing that there's a million people working on this project and they might not even get to be the decision maker at the end of it.
People often talk about how expensive transit projects are in the United States compared to other countries. And I think we can blame Jonathan and the consultant class for that, right? I think
I agree.
that's the
I think
answer.
consulting firms can take some blames. I'm just kidding, but I do agree that it is the best of public interest to build that in-house expertise as much as possible. And I don't think it's just limited to transit or infrastructure projects in general. Just how we treat public employees and governance and how government is structured. The culture of that in the United States has been a little difficult, I would say, to support and retain good talents to work for governments and then build those that expertise that you can use it back into other projects in the future. And I think those are the kind of political climate that made those consulting firms to flourish. And I am myself benefiting from that in a way, which actually is a great opportunity for me to clarify that everything I say on this podcast is on personal capacity as a transit lover and do not represent my employer or any other projects that I work on.
Don't Google Jonathan or his employer or send mean emails to his employer or anything. Sam, do you have to go? Because I'm realizing There's no good way to drop you from this without stopping the recording. Or you could just hang out and chime in at any point.
Sam can stay. We
Sam,
like Sam.
can you stay?
Yeah. Do you have any other questions?
Sure, yeah, I can say actually related to that consultant thing. I don't know if you all saw, like Boston's new mayor, Michelle Wu. She's like vowed to kick the consultants out of the process and instead build that like in-house expertise and push the responsibility actually back onto city employees. So
it is interesting. I mean, I do see the value of consulting in a way that there's certain specialized skill that you don't really need to retain in your department at all times. So you bring those expertise, oftentimes, out of your region, those to bring that outside perspective to actually build those, oftentimes big mega projects forward. But if you are planning on, say, building this many light rails in this many years, or this many bus rapid transit in that many years, you're going to do that over and over again. And the best way to retain those expertise and increase those public confidence in the things that we do as government is to retain those talents in-house.
Here's a question, and it's going to have a terrible, boring answer. How do we convince MnDOT to, and it's a question from Twitter, a couple of people asked about MnDOT increasing their investment in transit. Like, how do we convince the state to do a good thing? It's that question again.
I do feel like MnDOT is a mystery organization to me. I personally know people who work at MnDOT that I love connecting with, and they are some of the smartest people that I run into personally and professionally. But at the same time, the stories I hear about their organizations are vastly different depending on who you talk to. And this boring answer actually goes back to the state legislature. So we need that champion in the state legislature's House and the Senate to actually push those state departments to actually build the policy and then implement those policies and stick to those words.
So we're waiting on Paul Gazelka again, right?
The thing that I will remind, like, I feel like this is like the thing that I always want to, like, when people like want to like have any faith in MnDOT, this is like, I think there's lots of amazing people who work at MnDOT, but also MnDOT is a road agency, right? Like the biggest asset of the state of Minnesota is our highway system, right? That is where the vast majority of our like dollars, right? If we were to inventory the assets, it's in roads, right? So like MnDOT as a function, because of that, is going to be a road building agency, right? And we're seeing that in like Rethinking 94, right? Like this insane recommendation out of MnDOT to build more lanes there. Like that makes no sense. And that's what you're going to get out of an agency that's primarily focused on on building roads. And so I think that there has to be some different, like if the push to get more transit is not coming out of MnDOT. Like I don't have a ton of faith that like that is the place to find solutions for increasing transit, because I just think that like the thing that keeps MnDOT alive is cars. And it's like, it's the primary funding agency. It is the biggest asset. Like it's just not, it is not the place that is going to be like the biggest proponent of transit.
I mean, it is difficult to change that culture. Like, I understand the difficulty of that. It is a big agency that has a lot of different moving parts, and in a way, and for good reasons, that it moves slow so it's stable, that you're the steward of the whole statewide system. But once we start pushing the boundaries a little bit by little, and in a way infiltrate some of the bureaucracy with people who are really outspoken about the transit value and climate values in state agencies and local governments, I think we can see those changes happening. And I'm positive, staying positive about that.
Here's another question from Twitter. What should the Twin Cities focus on more going forward? Larger projects like light rail or expansion of bus rapid transit? Also, signal priority and slowness of the light rails. How can we advocate for better transit?
I think both, but I want to reframe the question in a way that there's a need for service improvements, and we need to choose the right tool per the need. So each different corridor, say, and different neighborhoods have different needs and demands for transportation, and there's a right tool. In some cases, light rail may be a right tool. Some cases, bus rapid transit may be the right tool for it. And we have kind of two flavors of bus rapid transit going on in the Twin Cities, where Orange Line and Red Line and the future Gold and Purple Line would be more highway focused, more long distance BRT has focused on dedicated right of way and dedicated infrastructure, whereas the A line through B, C, D, E, and on, those alphabetized as lettered lines, are arterial BRT, where it fits on the city grid network a little better, and then it's mostly focused on upgrading the existing services. So for different solution, for different contexts, there's different solutions for it. And I think we should be open to all those different solutions before we choose, we're going to build a light rail and they're going to go here.
It seems like light rail is always a disaster, and BRT is so much cheaper. Let's just plop down 15 of them next month, please. Right? Is light rail ever not a disaster? We can't do it.
I kind of want to go back to the same point where, like, those construction expertise and project management expertise, like, we don't do that often. The last time we built a mega project like this was Green Line, and then the Green Line extension, and then the Blue Line extension is still keep going. But once you have those expertise that built through this in Minnesota construction market and then the soil, they don't necessarily stay within the agency. So I think keeping those expertise within the agency would be nice, and then great for future projects.
I think it's a different question, right? So the way that I see these two is like BRT versus LRT is in a really different way, right? So like color BRT is really about like traditional kind of like spoken wheel or LRT, right? Or like BRT in terms of like getting a worker in and out, right? A lot of that is about like coming from like the exurbs or the suburbs into the city back and forth, but at a more frequent rate. BRT is sort of what I see as sort of the solution for really frequent bus routing that can just be more stable, right? It can be more convenient. It can be more just like, when that bus is going to come, you can very clearly see the stops, you're getting better amenities. It feels a little bit more elevated because it's coming all the time anyways, right? Like the Route 5, like I can't believe it's taking this long for that to be a BRT route, right? Because it's a massively used route. The same with like, I can't believe like the 10 is going to be still going to take quite a lot of time, because those are routes that are just coming through really highly populated areas all the time. And that is just a much more convenient, nicer looking, easier way to have that really frequent transit access. Light rail is like a whole other beast. It's a completely other animal, right? So like, it is not the same as like the subway. And I think that's a really important like caveat, right? Like if you go to New York, and that is like, that's their entire, like the huge vast proportion of their service is through subway, is through trains, or any other major city. That's because it's existed for a billion years, right? Here, and in places like Seattle or Denver, places that are actively building it now, light rail is, yes, partially about service improvement, partially about like nicer experience, but it's largely about economic development. Right. So it is not in the way, like the great way of like BRT just being like, oh, this is nicer and more convenient. And like, I can see like the stop timing and I can pay before I get on, like all of those, like, oh, what a like great little like cheap upgrade. Like BRT is, what, like $2 million a mile. I don't know, Jonathan, you probably know this number more than I do. It is an enormous investment. And that investment is typically tied to the desire of a region to get more of an investment out of that rail project, right? So when we think about the very first rail project here, where did it go? From downtown Minneapolis to the airport. That is not about transit service. That is about economic development.
So pause for a moment to explain what you mean by economic development.
So it's about building like economic development, right? It's about making money.
So plop down a station and hope that a bunch of development springs up around that station so you can increase tax revenue. That's
You got it, right? The idea is that you spend an ass load of money, like just so much money, but that it's going to fundamentally transform the station routing, right? It is why the very first light rail line is from downtown Minneapolis, so our core economic center, out to the airport, right? So the goal is you're bringing tourists, you're bringing, well, to Mall of America, right? So even this is even more crystallizing, right? To Mall of America, right? So you're bringing tourists, you're bringing business professionals, you're bringing anyone, and you're giving tourism dollars right out of your region, but you're taking people from the core out to the airport and back. You're shuttling them back and forth. And the idea is that also that development is going to happen completely along the route, right? People are going to choose to live along that route. Big major investments are going to happen from, point A to point B. And we saw that, and we're still seeing that. We are still seeing along Hiawatha massive housing investments because there's transit there. So what's the next routing? To go from downtown Minneapolis to the capital, right? So we make that similar kind of decision, right? We're not building light rail because again, a great route like the 10, which goes every 10 minutes and sees, thousands of customers a day. The same with the 5. We are not choosing the most used routes when we build light rail, and people can disagree with me. That is fine. But my perspective on this is we're not interested as a state for building light rail for users. We're using it as a means of building the states or those cities' property tax capacities, right? So every light rail, and as you think about it, now you think about, okay, so Green Line extension is now going to go from downtown St. Paul all the way out to Eden Prairie through places where there's significant housing. There's a lot of places that are redevelopable along the corridor, and you're getting, again, that suburban worker from suburban areas into downtown or into downtown St. Paul. The same with Blue Line. You're going from downtown Minneapolis out to the Target campus. And there's, again, a lot of redevelopable land and redevelopable area along that routing. And so it's, it is not, neither of those routes are about replacing a route that has significant ridership. It's really about adding in this economic development factor. So they're just so completely different that when we talk about BRT versus LRT, the goals, I think, of those types of projects are just totally different.
So to sum up, we spend ungodly amounts of money, transit money, not serving transit riders.
I think that's a pretty fair thing to say. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a service benefit, right? I think Blue Line extension has the highest service benefit that we're going to see out of a light rail line, right? Because there's so much transit ridership between Minneapolis, North Minneapolis, Brooklyn Park. But kind of up until this point, I don't know, Jonathan, you can weigh in. I don't think so.
I think that's a great point about economic development aspects of those heavy infrastructure, heavy capital investment with light rail, that it definitely directs the economic development energy into certain nodes around the light rail stations. And you can see that along Hiawatha and on University Avenue with blue and green lines. But I do want to push back just a little bit that those investments will make lasting impacts on the physical aspects of how the land use and how we move around all across the metro for generations to come. If we take care of this system that we build in 40 to 50 years ahead of time, that those are the future demand that we are generating. Those are the future developments and housings and commerce that's going to go on the light rail instead of along Highway 100, 169, or other suburban locations that are not as transit accessible. So when there is a growth for demand, there's a demand for growth, and Twin Cities are growing, and we are really lucky to live in a metro area that is actually growing and people are moving into our region. And we are directing those energy into where it's focusable on light rail and light rail station areas. So those trips that are going to be made in the future, when it happens, are going to be more sustainable and more efficient. Going back to the New York City example, New York City subway, most of the routes in the outer borders are built in the middle of nowhere. Those are built in nothingness, and now it's really built up, one of the densest part of the country. So if you think of that in a longer perspective, I think this is the right investment. I'm not arguing that we should prioritize new transit demand over serving the current transit riders, but in the long run, I think it is great that we focus on those investments in a transforming way.
Are you saying we're making a 100-year investment here? Because I don't want to prioritize people 100 years from now. I won't be here.
I think no. I mean, I'm not saying what you're saying, Jonathan, isn't true, but I am saying that we're building lines for riders that don't exist yet, right? And I don't think that's bad. I don't. This is not. This is. I'm not like an anti light rail. Like, would love give me all the light rail, right? But I think you're right, and I think that that's your point is exactly why light rail is being built in the way that it's being built. It's built in mind, in hopes for future development, right? And so ideally that future development is people who move to those station areas and then never have to buy a car, right? Because they live 5 seconds from a light rail station and they never need to do anything else because that light rail station can take them to a bus, can take them to anywhere they want to go. But I don't think in a lot of places that exists yet, right? I think that light rail is being developed in places that there's not active current ridership, right? You know, I work for a city along Southwest LRT, and all of our station areas don't have a ton of high density. Well, one of them has existing a ton of high density housing. It's the densest stop on the light rail, right? But those stops and then stops into Eden Prairie, into St. Louis Park, there's going to be a lot of development that comes later on the road because the state made that investment. And I think that there's, you know, that's the priority that's being made. And, you know, whether that's right or wrong, I think it's probably better for us to spend money improving like actively used frequent transit. But, you know, if there's money to be spent, like there's federal dollars to be spent, do them both. I think it's really, really important to talk about them really differently. And that's more like my argument is that talking about BRT versus LRT as if they're the same thing, as if they're the same solution, they're not the same solution. They are fundamentally different solutions for different problems.
Okay, somebody asked about the speed limit on Nicollet Mall. Has something happened with that? Why is that a question? I guess I don't ride the bus on Nicollet Mall enough.
I think it's because the buses in Nicollet Mall are so slow.
Haven't they always been slow? Has it changed is what I'm asking, because I don't know.
Maybe I wasn't around long enough to be on Nicollet Mall in the 70s or 80s, so I don't know.
It's a good question. They are extremely slow, and there are a lot of buses on Nicollet Mall. And Metro Transit's position is that it was set to maintain a safe environment, set at 10 miles an hour to maintain a safe environment for pedestrians and cyclists. The plan is to return to Hennepin in late 2022, the detoured routes after construction is finished and waiting shelters are installed. Because there's a lot of buses on Nicollet Mall. I feel like that's all.
There are a lot of buses on Nicollet
Anyone
Mall.
have strong opinions?
If you told me something went over 10 miles an hour before, like, ever,
right,
I would be shocked.
Yeah.
I don't think does not seem like earth-shattering information.
Yeah.
This is my spitballing. I don't do service planning for Metro Transit, and my proposal is to move buses off of Nicollet Mall and put them on Marquette and 2nd Avenue, where we have dedicated bus lanes that are 2 lanes that buses can actually take over from each other. And it's a really nice bus priority infrastructure on Marquette and 2nd Avenue that are mostly designed to accommodate AM peak and PM peak suburban commuter buses to come in downtown and then pick up and leave in PM. But now, as we briefly touched on how the transit demand is kind of changing since COVID, is that there is less demand for those suburban express buses, and we are seeing more demands on those enhanced local services. So why don't we use that nice bus infrastructure for local buses, because it's underutilized during midday?
Sounds like a good idea to me.
But it is nice to, just get up on Nicollet.
When we move them off of Nicollet Mall, do you have any prediction, like how much buses will be sped up through downtown? Like the 6, for example, going to Hennepin. I've got to think that's going to save like 2 or 3 minutes or something, because it's so slow now.
Yeah, I can't speak for the exact number because it really depends on where people are actually going, the final destination. If people are going actually to the destination closer to Nicollet Mall, maybe that's better for some people, or you have to get off at Hennepin and walk over. Uh, so I think there's a trade-off on those. But in terms of how fast the vehicle can move, I think uh, Nicollet is not designed to prioritize bus speed.
Here's a question from Twitter. I've been really curious about what the process would be to create, improve accessibility at bus light rail stops. There's just so much hostile anti-homeless design, i.e. lack of seating at stops and MSP, but I don't know what the policy mechanisms would be to address it substantively. Peggy Sue.
That's a great question. I don't know that I know the answer to this, right? I think this is, again, like, I feel like my answer to this is like it's more complicated than that, which is a handful of things, right? So one, we live in Minnesota and it's winter right now. So snow removal, I think, drives a lot of design decisions, right? So benches, like other like amenities broadly, make it really difficult to add because you eventually need to clear snow from platforms. And that is a huge accessibility thing, right? If you're blind, if you're in a wheelchair, like those being like having the priority in the space and room to clear snow so that when it is snowing, it's easy for you to get on the stop is really, really massive. I think the other thing is a lot of decisions by Metro Transit are likely made due to like crime, right? Is like crime and loitering. Whether like, and I'm not even going to enter that as like a conversation, but I think that that's like going to be a tough sell to have anyone give a complete shit about at Metro Transit, right? Because I think that there's a lot of design that is intentionally super hostile for that reason, is like the belief that like making anything more comfortable is going to increase crime activity. And like I don't know. I think that people also want to feel safe when they ride. And so I think there'd be a lot of transit users who say like, maybe it's like the trade-off is better that there's not a bunch of comfy benches for people to loiter on so that I feel like as a woman less harassed, like I've definitely been harassed riding the train a million times. So I think that there's a give and a take to that. Like I don't necessarily find anything like completely inhospitable about like existing amenities at train stations. Like there are definitely places where like especially along the Green Line, there's like straight up not even a bench at some stops, which is awful. But I also think it's just like it's a balance, right? You're balancing like accessibility in terms of like snow clearing and also like crime or perceived crime. And I don't know that there's a lot of people who are like super excited to have that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, compared to like other, say, East Coast cities with like a C rail system where it actually has a station building and a station attendant and fare gates and whatnot that has enclosed structures, most of our light rail station designs are really focusing on the cost effectiveness, like how we can build this light rail system in a very cost effective way, and that kind of that's reflected on the station designs and shelter designs, I think. So that kind of value physically manifests on what you see on the street. And I agree in a way that if the bench availability is less of an issue, if your train comes every 3 to 5 minutes, then you don't have to wait that long.
Yeah.
So I think the focus should be, of course, we should design our physical infrastructures and transit infrastructure hospitable and welcoming to everyone. But at the same time, the best thing that we can do with this existing infrastructure is to increase service so you don't have to wait that long and spend that much time waiting for a train at a train station.
Also, the best thing we can do to keep our transit system from becoming a shelter is to like get people housed. There's a reason people are spending the night on a train. It's because they don't have housing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I'm like, I don't really want to dig into crime, right? Because I think that the hostile architecture of some of our light rail infrastructure, I think the green line is worse than the blue line in my experience in terms of like benches and seating and stuff is a symptom of like a lot of other problems, right? Like it is that there's not enough housing and that there is like a lot of just like general insecurity that leads to increased crime, right? And so that increased crime or the perception of increased crime is how you end up with station designs in the ways that you get it, right? Even, like just people saying like, oh my gosh, we don't want the like feral youth taking the light rail. There's a literal comment at a hearing during Southwest LRT, right?
Feral? Somebody said feral?
Yes, my husband and I, this is our favorite joke, is that they're like, someone was like, I don't want the like feral youth coming to Eden Prairie or some nonsense like that. Like, this is like, I don't know. I wonder if I can like Google it and find this quote.
I wonder if this person realizes they're all driving. They're coming to your city in a car. It's all car crime these days. Transit crime was way overblown. It's car crime.
Yeah, I don't know. I just remember that like being like a quote when like there like a few years ago in terms of like from the Star Tribune or something about just like someone being like the feral youth, they're gonna come to whatever. Anyways, I think like that perception is and like the existence of those things, like people sheltering under shelters for long periods of time, like sleeping on benches, like just aggregating generally, right? That is all a symptom of like something very separate of transit in terms of like our economic stability for a lot of people. That is now just being manifested in the way that we design the infrastructure.
Have we run through everything? I'm going to scroll through Twitter. Time frame for the buses to shift from Bryant to Linden Avenue. This is a very hyper local question. So at a certain point, buses will shift. The 4 will shift from Bryant to Lindale. I think Metro Transit said later this year, meaning 2022, once those infrastructure improvements are made. Am I right?
Yeah, I think they want to make sure that all the infrastructure is set in place on Lindale, say 50th and Lindale, adding ADA pads and center medians at unsignalized bus stop locations. So make sure those are in place before they move buses from Bryant to Lindale, is my understanding.
Oh, we need to talk about Blue Line. PeggySue, you've got some Blue Line information or knowledge, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say if there's a few minutes, I'll just give a quick Blue Line plug, which is that routing is like currently being sussed out, right, for Blue Line. So Metro Transit is actively seeking feedback on the routing options. So maybe John, when you share this, you can add the link in.
Okay.
When you share the podcast, but so there's some options in terms of just how it routes through Minneapolis, right? So the vast majority of the Blue Line extension routing is going to stay the same. Basically, once you get to like Robbinsdale-ish forward, especially in Brooklyn Park, like that routing's all the same. But there is kind of some desire for Metro Transit to kind of figure out what the community really prefers from downtown Minneapolis to Robbinsdale. And so there's essentially 2 options. Option A is to route from Target Field up West Broadway, and then it would connect in Robbinsdale. Option B is to route northbound on Washington Avenue, and then westbound on Lindale Avenue, and then connect kind of by North Memorial into Robbinsdale. So they are looking for feedback on what the community would prefer. I have a lot of opinions. Do you want my opinions?
I definitely want your opinions. Yeah. So
okay.
It originally bypassed North Minneapolis entirely, right?
Yes, which is so racist that we can talk about it another time. I mean, no, it was like extremely racist, right? It was very much path of least resistance. Bring it up, high, like Golden Valley. Wait, what is that? Highway. What is that highway? I don't know. 55? That's it.
Yep.
Like it was essentially like fully bypass North Minneapolis, go straight around it, and then meet up along BNSF right of way. BNSF said, no, we're not going to do this. We don't want to give you the right of way. They could not reach an agreement. And they couldn't reach an agreement, so much so to the point that it completely canceled that routing option. It can no longer go, up 55 to the BNSF right away. And so this meant they would have to kind of look at completely new routing options, which has been really, this is a tough thing. It's a really tough pill to swallow. I don't know that Metro Transit has really acknowledged some of the damage that they've already done through this process, right? Because what happened was, and again, this is like my beef, right, of LRT. LRT is economic development. So what happened is in the Harrison neighborhood, and if you drive up 55 right now, you will start to see what is essentially speculative light rail development. You will start to see a ton of buildings because people saw LRT routing and said, okay, bought a bunch of land, displaced a ton of people, and started building. And, for better or for worse, now that routing isn't happening and those buildings are still getting built. So it's great. We're adding new housing stock. But this adds like a really new and very scary element of this transit option. And so I really, really encourage people to check it out and really, if you have the opportunity to talk to people along West Broadway as you think about how you might add comment, or you can read through some of the comments along this routing option, is that there is a really, really significant displacement risk that can happen with a routing option that goes up West Broadway. Now, just from like a transit perspective, like it makes a ton more sense to go up West Broadway, like a ton more sense. It will be much more used. It goes through kind of the heart of North Minneapolis. I think it's a great routing option. And then the other option is to go up Washington Avenue, which is like fully deranged. There's nothing there. And then go up Linden Avenue, where there's also sort of nothing there. The part of Linden Avenue North that it would be going up is predominantly single family homes. So it's really not dense. There is some redevelopment potential, but it really does not go through the vast majority of like a more dense, really business center focused North Minneapolis. And I think that there's a lot of thoughts on both sides, right? I'm personally really pro the West Broadway route. I think it's going to serve a lot more people, and I think it's going to give a lot of people a really amazing access to like a really important cultural center for Minneapolis. And I think that there's some really great advocates, like the West Broadway Coalition has sort of said, like, we're ready for this, like, bring it here. Like, we know that there's going to be change, but we're ready for that change, and we want to just be in control of that change. And that is, what Metro Transit is really trying to do. So the other thing that people can do is get involved. There's an anti-displacement working group. So if people have any expertise in anti-displacement or really want to work on that issue, that's a really great way to get involved. But they are kind of doing something new. Metro Transit, for all of the wrongs, there's always like a lot of greats. And Metro Transit has been trying to learn every routing that like better ways that they can kind of work with businesses and help them. Now, funding's really limited, right? You can't just like buy up a bunch of properties and then like give them over to community orgs or like give businesses money to stay in business while construction's happening. They're not quite as able to do things like that, but I think they are really trying. And this anti-displacement working group, I think, is like really above and beyond what they've done in any other light rail situation. And it's looking at just kind of like policies and ordinances and also, financial benefits. Like, what are the ways that Metro Transit can kind of support these businesses as this, what could be just a really like devastating thing happens in this community that is predominantly Black, is predominantly low income. And again, like light rail is not about people moving. It is about dollar moving. And so I think that, really take a look, really like stay like alert to this. I think that there will be, a lot of conversation as like more routing gets like more firmed up. Right now, it's sort of like, here are the two options. And Metro Transit has sort of said, which is in compliance with the federal process. And maybe Jonathan can add anything that he'd like to say is more of like a transit professional, right? Like Metro Transit has to explore all the alternatives. They can't just be like, this is the best one. They really have to say when they ask for the federal funding for the project, like, this is 100% the route. We looked at every other option. No other options worked for these reasons, right? So as much as I've kind of said this is like, it just sucks for them to spend all of this money kind of like not knowing where it's going to go and maybe displacing people along both sides, right? Like drawing investment to kind of both areas of North Minneapolis so that people might like take the gamble. I will say that, I think that they're doing a really good job and just stay like tuned into this, because I think in the spring and summer, it's really going to start to like, some decisions are going to get made.
And the anti-displacement stuff has to start now, because once the route is set, like it's the cat is out of the barn, the cat's out of the bag, horse is out of the barn.
Yes,
something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think as soon as the route is set, I think property values in North Minneapolis are already so like low, like so much lower than other places in the city. And it's not just Minneapolis, it's Robbinsdale, it's going to be Brooklyn Park. Like it's going to be the entire line, right? But I think I'm especially focused on North Minneapolis, just knowing that like the vulnerability of a lot of the people who live in this area and live in maybe precarious housing situations. They're not the owners of their house, and their house might get bought by Metro Transit for right of way. There might be a lot of speculative investment. So it's one of those things to just be like, if you're looking for a project and how you can protect people and how you can be an advocate, like this is definitely going to be a project to watch.
Jonathan, do you have any a closing item you'd like to introduce?
I think we briefly touched on it. But for the labor issues, the labor shortage, that how Metro Transit were kind of forced to reduce the service level with the recent December service change. And I wanted to just advocate for faster service is cheaper to run, and it's more attractive, and it's more labor friendly.
How do we get faster service? What do we need to do?
We talked about it, the dedicated transit lane. We talk about transit signal priorities on intersections, prepaid boarding, just like on metro lines, that you don't hold up the line at the door, so you pay ahead of time. So all those, in a way, if you think about it from a big picture, it's a small item. So there's low-hanging fruits that you can implement in many of the routes, not just the metro system. And rebalancing bus stops. And so instead of stopping buses at every block, balance it in a way that it makes sense. So you balance out the accessibility needs and speed priorities. Speeding up those buses not only makes bus system more attractive and more useful and give people's valuable time back to the riders, it's cheaper to operate, because if you calculate how many buses you need to run a route, you need to think about end-to-end travel time and how many buses you need to offer a certain service level that you promise to people. And if you reduce that travel time, that means that you don't need that as many buses, meaning you don't need that as many drivers to offer people the same level of service, meaning you can save those savings and invest back into a more service levels at the same route or different routes. So I want to advocate for looking into more service efficiency improvements and speed improvements, and put our attention a little bit more on those to tackle the labor shortage issues a little bit.
Yeah, because you got buses moving faster along a route. They finish that route faster and running again, right? Am I explaining that properly? Mm-hmm. I think we need to emphasize this. So, faster service is cheaper to run. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you to our caller who has stayed with us this whole time. I forgot to hang up on you.
You're welcome.
Sam, do you have anything last
Sam,
that you want to add?
You have the right to introduce your closing thought here, since you stayed with us.
Just related to the Blue Line. So like City of Crystal today tweeted a photo of a potential like Bass Lake station. And they have this wild design where the street is like split into like a divided highway that's elevated over the cross street, but the light rail is in the middle, and it's going to cross at grade at the cross street. Even though they've elevated like the actual like car road to above grade, the light rail is still going to be at grade and have to like wait to cross the street. It's just, sometimes it's hard to just follow along this stuff, you know.
So the road is higher than the station? Is that what you're describing?
So they've like grade separated the highway from the cross street, so it like goes on an overpass over the cross street. But the light rail is still at ground level, so it's still going to cross at grade and have to like wait for traffic at the cross street.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how far out those like station designs really like are. Like, I think that there's still some reworking that will happen with those. I don't know, Jonathan, if you want to add in your experience when there's not even a routing decision, how well formed the station
I
designs
feel like
are.
I'm just imagining the engineers or graphics people who had to drop that rendering, and I think they were asked to come up with options, but the light rail must stay at grade, and that's what they came up with.
Yeah.
I think they were just asked to make that, and then
hilarious.
that's what happened. Yeah. Yeah, so it doesn't, I don't like either options, to be honest. I think it's cleaner and it makes more sense to just elevate that. Elevate the light rail. But you can be creative.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're like, these are like without like a ton of engineering feasibility probably as well. And like center running at grade is like likely the cheapest. I don't know. So they're just like, we just need to have some options. And then these could probably change as soon as we know how expensive or dumb they are. So I wouldn't get like until like actual, like the whole line has been set. I don't know how invested I would get in any one particular station design, because I think that they can change a lot.
Yeah, I don't know how much it costs to build a roadway overpass, the interchange option, compared to making your light rail alignment in an aerial overpass in an elevated structure. I don't know the cost difference between those two, but I also, if I'm reading between lines, there may be cost issues involved where light rail construction fund has to come from a certain fund over roadway funds is more flexible, that you can elevate those and reduce those conflicts.
Yeah, I think you end up with in these scenarios, especially with some of these light rail designs that like don't make the complete most sense, and it may even get built in that way too, where you're like balancing like totally different pots of money, where like you're just trying to get it built, and I don't know, you get a secant wall.
Yeah, this interchange option really reminds me of Hiawatha and Lake Street Station. The only difference is the light rail is at grade instead of overpass. Yeah, I don't know if I would enjoy walking around that intersection.
I don't think I've ever been to Crystal. Have any of you been to Crystal? Where is Crystal? I don't even know where Crystal is.
Crystal is like directly west of Lake Robbinsdale in North Minneapolis, north of Golden Valley. And there used to be like, I guess maybe it still is there. I don't know. There used to be like a really cute, cheap dinner theater there. Like, you know, like $2 movies, but also like snacks, like good snacks. And also there's pretty good Goodwill in Crystal, and a very confusing Target. Can you tell I live in North Minneapolis? Like, I've been to Crystal a handful of times, and the Target there is not good.
Got a decent mini Target in the Wedge.
I wish I had a mini Target. I would kill to have a mini Target. I would kill to have literally anything walkable. I would kill.
Well, I mean, you could have moved to the Wedge.
I would not kill.
Could have moved to the Wedge.
I love my house.
Okay, this episode is starting to drag. Thank you, Sam, for that.
Thank you.
Thank all three of you for spending so much of your evening with me. Talk about transit. It's been the Wedge Live podcast. Thank you to Jonathan Ahn, PeggySue Imihy, and first-time caller, longtime listener, Sam Penders. I'm your host, John Edwards.
Calling out, tap, 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 tap. people. This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.